The chains we don't see. The wind never rested on the plains. It whispered, clawed, and carried dust like secrets no one dared to speak aloud. Elena Voss had long ago learned to move within it, her steps measured, her gaze lowered, her presence quiet enough to be mistaken for contentment. But silence, she had discovered, was not peace. It was merely the absence of resistance. Each morning began the same. She rose before the sun, lit the stove, and worked without pause or complaint. Her hands bore the memory of labor, raw in places, hardened in others, but her face remained composed, untouched by the unrest beneath. The homestead stood isolated against the vast stretch of land, a place where time seemed to stall and emotions were buried beneath duty. Caleb Voss preferred it that way. He was a man shaped by control, his voice rarely raised, yet always firm enough to end discussion before it began. He spoke in instructions rather than conversation, his presence filling the space like a weight that could not be shifted. To him, Elena was not unkindly treated, but she was not cherished either. She was part of the life he had built, as necessary and as unremarkable as the walls that sheltered them. That morning, he returned from town with something new. Elena noticed it not from his words, but from the way his horse moved, slower, burdened, and from the faint metallic clatter that followed. She stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the harsh sunlight, and saw it then. A wooden cage secured to the back of the wagon. Inside it sat a man. He was bound at the wrists, his posture upright despite the obvious strain, his dark hair falling in uneven strands across his face. Dust clung to his skin, but it could not disguise the steadiness in his expression. He did not look broken. He did not look afraid. He looked waiting. "Elena," Caleb called, his tone as unyielding as ever. "Fetch water." She obeyed, though her attention lingered on the stranger. As she approached, the man lifted his gaze, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow into something sharper, quieter. His eyes met hers, not with desperation, not with pleading, but with a clarity that unsettled her more than any cry for help could have. She handed the canteen to Caleb, who drank first before tossing a small portion toward the cage. The water barely reached the man, spilling into the dust before he could catch it. Caleb did not notice or did not care. "Picked him up cheap," Caleb said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Apache. Will fetch a better price further north." Elena said nothing, but the word lingered in her thoughts. Apache. It was meant to define him, reduce him, make him easier to own. Yet the man inside the cage seemed untouched by it, as though whatever name the world placed upon him failed to capture what he was. Later, when Caleb disappeared into the barn, Elena found herself drawn back to the wagon. She told herself it was duty, that the prisoner required water, that neglect would reflect poorly on a household. But even as she lifted the canteen, she knew the truth was less simple. She approached slowly, aware of every sound, the creak of wood, the shifting of dust beneath her boots. The man watched her again, his gaze steady, unreadable. This time, she did not toss the water. She knelt beside the cage, carefully angling the canteen through the bars. For a brief moment, their hands brushed, hers tentative, his restrained by iron. The contact was fleeting, accidental, yet it lingered in a way she could not explain. "Drink," she said softly, though she did not know if he understood. He did. He took the water with quiet precision, his movements controlled despite the constraints. There was no rush, no desperation, only a calm acceptance that unsettled her more deeply than fear would have. Elena studied him then, not as property, not as danger, but as something undeniably human. There was a wound along his shoulder, poorly treated, the dried blood dark against the skin. Without thinking, she reached for it, her fingers hovering before making contact. He did not pull away. The silence between them shifted, not empty, but filled with something unspoken. It was not trust, not yet, but it was not indifference either. It was recognition. Footsteps broke the moment. Elena withdrew quickly, rising just as Caleb emerged from the barn. His eyes flicked between them, lingering a second too long on the proximity, the stillness. "Keep your distance," he said, his voice low but edged with warning. "He's not like us." Elena nodded, though the words did not settle as they once might have. "Not like us." The phrase echoed in her mind, turning over itself, losing certainty with each repetition. That night, as the wind pressed against the walls and the fire burned low, Elena lay awake beside her husband. Caleb's breathing was steady, undisturbed, as though the world existed exactly as it should. But Elena felt something shifting. She closed her eyes and saw the man in the cage. Not his chains, not his condition, but his gaze. Clear, unyielding, alive in a way she had not felt in years. For the first time, the boundaries of her life did not feel permanent. They felt fragile. Outside, the wind carried on, restless and insistent, as though urging something unseen toward its breaking point. And somewhere in the darkness, the faint sound of metal against wood echoed softly, just enough to be heard, not enough to be understood. Elena opened her eyes, and this time, she did not try to ignore it. The forbidden spark. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, one that existed beneath Caleb's notice but consumed Elena entirely. She moved through her chores with the same quiet precision, yet her awareness had shifted, drawn again and again toward the wagon at the edge of the property. It was no longer just a structure of wood and iron. It had become a boundary she could not ignore. She told herself she returned out of necessity. The wound on the prisoner's shoulder demanded care, and neglect would only lead to infection. It was a practical concern, nothing more. Yet each time she approached, canteen in hand, she felt the same unspoken pull, as though something within her had already crossed a line her mind had yet to acknowledge. He watched her as he always did, silent, composed, his gaze steady without being intrusive. The absence of words forced everything else into sharper focus. The subtle shifts of expression, the measured movements, the space between them that seemed to hold more meaning than conversation ever could. Elena knelt beside the cage, her hands more certain now as she reached through the bars. She had brought a cloth this time, dampened and clean. Without asking permission, she pressed it gently against his wound. He tensed, but did not resist. The contact lingered longer than necessary. Elena became acutely aware of the heat of his skin beneath her touch, of the way his breath slowed rather than quickened, as though he accepted her presence not as intrusion, but as something inevitable. "You'll need this to heal," she murmured, her voice barely above the wind. He did not respond, yet his gaze held hers with an intensity that unsettled her composure. It was not gratitude, not in the way she had known it before. It was something deeper, something that recognized her not as a caretaker, but as a person standing at the edge of a choice. She withdrew her hand too quickly, as though the realization itself had burned her. That evening, Caleb's mood darkened without warning. He spoke little during supper, his silence heavier than usual, his attention fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the house. "They're sending men north by the end of the week," he said at last. "Prisoners go with them." Elena's fingers tightened slightly around her utensil. So soon, Caleb glanced at her, his eyes narrowing just enough to register the question. "It's business," he replied. "No reason to keep him longer than necessary." No reason. The words echoed with a hollow finality that unsettled her more than she expected. She nodded, lowering her gaze, though her thoughts refused to settle. The idea of the man being taken, of vanishing into some distant transaction, left behind a strange, unspoken absence she could not justify. Later that night, sleep did not come easily. Elena lay still beside Caleb, her body rigid with the effort of silence while her mind refused to rest. The image of the cage lingered behind her eyes, but it was no longer the confinement that held her attention. It was the man within it, the quiet strength that defied the circumstances imposed upon him. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, she rose. The house remained still as she stepped outside, the cool air wrapping around her like a warning she chose to ignore. The moon cast pale light across the land, illuminating the wagon just enough to guide her steps. He was awake. She saw it in the way he shifted as she approached, in the way his gaze found hers without hesitation. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet awareness, as though he had expected her. Elena hesitated at the edge of the cage, her breath unsteady. "You should rest," she said softly, though the words felt misplaced the moment they left her lips. He tilted his head slightly, studying her in silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them felt thinner now, charged with something neither of them had named, yet both seemed to understand. Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew a small piece of bread. She held it out, her hand steady despite the tension building beneath her skin. This time, when their fingers touched, neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact was brief, but deliberate. Something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The careful boundaries Elena had maintained, the quiet justifications, the illusion of distance, fractured in that single moment of choice. This was no longer obligation. It was no longer curiosity. It was connection. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, though the words felt as though they applied more to herself than to him. His gaze did not waver. Slowly, he lifted his bound hands, the chains catching faintly in the moonlight. He did not shake them, did not struggle against them. He simply held them there, as if offering her the truth she had avoided. "This is what is." Elena's breath caught. Her eyes traced the line of iron, the weight of it, the permanence it represented. Then, almost without realizing it, her gaze shifted to the lock. The realization came quietly, but it struck with undeniable force. She could open it. The thought lingered, dangerous and undeniable. It settled in her mind with a clarity that left no room for denial, no space for retreat. For the first time, the possibility of action stood before her. Not distant, not abstract, but immediate. Real. Elena stepped back, the sudden distance between them feeling sharper than before. "I can't," she said, though the words lacked conviction. He lowered his hands, but his gaze remained fixed on hers, not demanding, not pleading, but certain. As though he already knew the answer she had yet to accept. The wind stirred again, restless and unrelenting, carrying with it the weight of something inevitable. Elena turned away, her pulse unsteady, her thoughts unraveling with each step she took back toward the house. But she did not feel relief. She felt the beginning of something she could not undo. Behind her, the faint sound of chains shifting broke the silence, not in struggle, but in quiet acknowledgement. Elena paused at the door, her hand hovering against the wood. For the first time, the life she had always known felt less like safety, and more like a cage, breaking the chains. The decision did not arrive with clarity or courage. It came quietly, like the wind that pressed against the walls, persistent, unrelenting, impossible to ignore. By morning, Elena understood something had already changed within her. The question was no longer if she would act, but when. Caleb left before midday. He offered no explanation beyond necessity. His tone clipped, his movements efficient as he prepared his horse. "I'll return by nightfall," he said, securing his rifle with practiced ease. His gaze lingered on Elena only briefly, as though confirming what he already believed, that she would remain exactly as she had always been. Predictable. Obedient. He rode out without looking back. Elena stood in the doorway long after he disappeared beyond the horizon, her hands still, her breath shallow. The silence that followed felt different from the quiet she had known before. It was no longer empty, it was waiting. She turned toward the wagon. Each step felt deliberate, as though the ground itself marked the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. The cage came into view slowly, its rough edges catching the light, its presence as undeniable as the choice before her. He was watching her. There was no surprise in his expression now, no uncertainty. Only a steady awareness that seemed to meet her halfway, as though he had already crossed the distance she still struggled to bridge. Elena stopped just short of the bars. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice steady despite the tension, rising within her. The words lingered between them, heavier than before. This was not observation, it was acknowledgement. His gaze did not waver. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the key. The metal felt colder than she expected, its weight disproportionate to its size. She turned it in her fingers, studying it as though it might offer resistance, as though it might remind her of the consequences she was choosing to ignore. But it did not. The lock yielded easily. The sound was small, barely more than a click, yet it echoed with finality. Elena hesitated only a moment before pulling the door open, the hinges creaking softly in protest. Freedom, once imagined, now stood within reach. He did not move immediately. Instead, he watched her, his stillness deliberate, as though waiting for something unspoken. Permission, certainty, or perhaps understanding. Elena stepped back, creating space between them. "Go," she said, though the word carried more weight than she anticipated. For a moment, it seemed he might refuse. Then, with controlled movement, he shifted forward, his limbs stiff from confinement, but steady despite it. The chains at his wrists remained, their presence a reminder that freedom was not yet complete. He stepped out of the cage. The distance between them changed instantly. Without the barrier, his presence felt sharper, more immediate. Elena became acutely aware of the space they shared, of the quiet intensity that filled it. He stood taller than she had realized, his movements restrained but purposeful. For the first time, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. "What now?" she asked, though the question revealed more than she intended. He glanced toward the open land beyond the homestead, then back at her. His expression shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. An invitation, or question. Elena followed his gaze, her breath catching as the reality of the moment settled over her. She had opened the cage. She had made her choice. But freedom, she realized, was not a single act. It was a path, and paths require direction. Behind her, the house stood unchanged, its walls solid, its familiarity intact. It offered safety, certainty, and a life she understood, even if that life had begun to suffocate her. Ahead, there was nothing but distance. And him. The sound of hooves shattered the silence. Elena's head snapped toward the horizon, her pulse quickening as a faint figure emerged against the dust. It was too soon for Caleb to return, but the shape was unmistakable. Rider. Approaching fast. He heard it too. In an instant, the stillness between them vanished, replaced by urgency. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for her wrist. Not forceful, but firm enough to command attention. Elena met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw something new within it. Not calm, not certainty, but warning. The choice that had felt distant only moments ago now demanded an answer. Stay and face the consequences, or leave and accept them. There was no time for hesitation. Elena turned back toward the house, her instincts pulling her toward the life she had known, the structure that had defined her existence. But the moment she took a step, she stopped, because she understood something with sudden, undeniable clarity. If she returned now, nothing would change. The silence would remain. The emptiness would deepen. And whatever had awakened within her would be buried again, this time beyond recovery. She looked at him once more. He had not moved, his grip on her wrist steady, his presence grounding in a way she could not explain. There was no demand in his expression, no expectation, only readiness. To leave, or to stay, with her. The sound of hooves grew louder. Elena exhaled slowly, the weight of her decision settling into something solid, something irreversible. Then, without another glance at the house, she tightened her grip on his hand. "Run," she said. They moved together. The land stretched before them, vast and unyielding, the wind rising as though to meet their escape. Behind them, the rider closed the distance, the echo of pursuit already taking shape. But Elena did not look back, because she understood now. Freedom was never given. It was taken, and it always came with a cost. Freedom has a price. The land offered no refuge, only distance. Elena ran until her breath burned and her legs threatened to fail, the rhythm of her steps driven less by strength than by the urgency behind her. The wind pressed against her, tugging at her clothes, her hair, as though the world itself resisted her escape. Yet she did not slow. Neither did he. Tala moved beside her with a steadiness that defied exhaustion, his stride efficient, his awareness fixed not only ahead but behind. Every sound mattered. The shifting of gravel, the distant echo of hooves, the subtle change in the wind that carried pursuit closer with each passing moment. They did not speak. Words would have broken something fragile, something newly formed between them. An understanding built not on promises, but on action. They had crossed a line together, and whatever lay ahead would belong equally to them both. The terrain shifted as they moved farther from the homestead. Dry earth gave way to uneven ground, scattered with rock and low brush that caught at their feet and slowed their pace. The open expanse that had once seemed endless now felt exposed, offering no cover, no concealment. Tala stopped abruptly. Elena nearly stumbled into him, her breath catching as she followed his gaze. Ahead, a narrow ridge cut across the land, its jagged edge offering the only visible shelter for miles. Without hesitation, he guided her toward it, his hand firm against her arm. They climbed quickly, the incline steep enough to demand effort, but mercifully short. At the top, the ground leveled into a shallow hollow, partially hidden from the plains below. For the first time since they had fled, they paused. Elena bent forward, her hands braced against her knees as she struggled to steady her breathing. The silence around them felt unnatural after the urgency of movement, each second stretching with quiet tension. "Will they follow?" she asked, her voice uneven. Tala did not answer immediately. His gaze swept the horizon, measuring distance, direction, and time with an instinct she could not match. When he finally looked at her, the truth was already evident. Yes. Elena sank onto the ground, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel it, the strain, the fear, the enormity of what she had done. There was no returning now. The thought did not bring panic as she expected. Instead, it carried a strange clarity, as though the uncertainty that had once defined her life had been replaced by something sharper, more honest. This was the cost. She looked at him then, truly looked, not as a prisoner, not as an escape, but as the man who had become the center of choice she could never undo. The distance between them felt smaller now, not because of proximity, but because of what they had already shared. "You could leave," she said quietly. "You know this land. You'd move faster alone." The words surprised even her, yet they felt necessary. This was not the same as unlocking a cage. This was survival. Tala's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened. He stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until she could feel the warmth of his presence, the steadiness that had grounded her since the moment she made her choice. He shook his head. Not leaving. The simplicity of it struck her more deeply than any spoken promise. There was no hesitation, no calculation, only decision. Elena exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing just enough to allow something else to surface. Trust. Not blind, not effortless, but real. A distant sound broke the moment. Hooves. Closer now. Elena rose quickly, her pulse quickening as the reality of pursuit returned with renewed force. She moved toward the edge of the ridge, her eyes scanning the horizon until she saw them. Two riders cutting across the plains with relentless precision. Caleb. Even at a distance, she recognized the rigid posture, the controlled aggression in the way he rode. Beside him, another figure, broader, deliberate. The sheriff. "They won't stop," she said, more to herself than to Tala. He joined her at the edge, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow into two opposing forces, pursuers and pursued, order and defiance, past and future. Then he turned away. Elena felt the shift before she understood it. There was a change in his posture, a quiet resolve that replaced urgency with something heavier. Final. He reached for her hand. The gesture was deliberate, grounding, and for a moment everything else faded. The wind, the distance, the approaching threat. There was only the contact, the unspoken acknowledgement of what they had become to each other. Then he released her and stepped back. Elena's breath caught. "What are you doing?" His gaze met hers, steady but different now. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only intention. He was choosing, not escape, but confrontation. A realization settled over her, cold and undeniable. "No," she said, shaking her head as she stepped toward him. "We go together." He did not move. The distance between them returned, sharper than before. This time it was not circumstance that created it, but decision. The sound of hooves grew louder, the riders closing in with every passing second. Tala's expression softened, just enough to reveal something beneath the surface. Not fear, not regret, but acceptance. He turned toward the ridge's edge, positioning himself between Elena and the approaching riders. The stance was unmistakable. Protection. Elena's chest tightened, the weight of understanding pressing down with sudden force. This was the cost of freedom. Not just escape, not just defiance, but sacrifice. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice breaking despite her effort to remain steady. He had not looked back. The wind rose again, sweeping across the ridge, carrying with it the sound of hooves, the promise of confrontation, and the echo of a choice that could no longer be undone. Elena stood frozen, caught between movement and stillness, between past and future, between love and consequence. Below, the riders reached the base of the ridge. And for the first time since she had opened the cage, Elena realized freedom had never been the end of the story. It was only the beginning.